Prince Harry sharing painful and deeply personal details of the family rift.
On the morning of March 3rd, in the fictional kingdom of Aylmer, Crown Prince Osric stepped in front of the cameras at Aldermere Palace, flanked by his aunt, the formidable Archduchess Petra, and his sister-in-law, Lady Wren of Caldbrook. What he said next stopped the country cold. The settlement between my brother, Prince Rhys, and Duchess Alara is now final. The Crown has acted in accordance with its duty to protect this family's youngest members. That duty does not end today. 7 sentences. But behind those 7 sentences sat 112 pages of legal maneuvering, a fractured marriage, a financial collapse, and a secret that would upend the house of Vailmore's understanding of its own bloodline. This is the story of how it all came apart, and what Prince Rhys chose to say once the ink was finally dry. To understand why March 3rd mattered, you have to go back 6 weeks, to a cold morning in the Aldermere Palace Archive Wing, where Archduchess Petra, sharp, unsentimental, and famously incapable of being surprised by anything, was handed a dossier by the palace's chief solicitor. It was labeled simply, Caldbrook Concerns. The dossier was not vague. It described, in careful legal language, a pattern that had been developing for over a year. The withdrawal of Prince Rhys and Duchess Alara's 2 children, 8-year-old Prince Tamsin and 6-year-old Princess Iona, from their scheduled royal tutoring program without explanation. The quiet redirection of a trust fund established for the children's education toward a private venture connected to Duchess Alara's media company, Alara Media Group, and a series of missed medical check-ins that had been flagged by the Crown's own pediatric office 3 separate times. Archduchess Petra did not believe, at first, that this was anything more than a couple under strain mishandling logistics. Marriages inside or adjacent to a royal house were hard enough without the tabloid circling. But what changed her mind was a single line buried on page 9, a licensing inquiry sent from Alara Media Group to an animation studio, asking about the cost of developing a children's streaming series based on royal family life, featuring characters modeled on Tamsin and Iona. That was the moment this stopped being a domestic matter and became a constitutional one. Word of the licensing inquiry reached Prince Rhys before it reached the palace's legal office, and by all accounts, it broke something in him. Rhys had spent the better part of 5 years defending his marriage publicly, insisting against a chorus of royal commentators that Alara's ambitions and the family's traditions could coexist. He had, friends say, believed that deeply. What the licensing inquiry revealed was that he might have been the last person in the country to still believe it. When palace lawyers began drafting the formal separation agreement, they discovered something buried inside the couple's original prenuptial contract, signed 7 years earlier under advisement from an outside firm. A clause granting Duchess Alara broad and, as it turned out, nearly unchallengeable rights over the creative and commercial use of the marital narrative, including recorded conversations, letters, and any media Rhys had personally authored during the marriage. At the time it was signed, this clause was framed as protection for Alara, a safeguard ensuring she would not be erased from the family story the way previous royal spouses had been. But its language was broad enough that, years later, it functioned as something else entirely, a mechanism by which Alara could control not just her own story, but Rhys's. Every interview he gave, every memoir passage he considered publishing, every documentary appearance, all of it, technically, ran through her approval. Legal historian Dr. Absalom Vane, who reviewed the agreement for a parliamentary inquiry, put it plainly in his written testimony. This is one of the more aggressive narrative control provisions I've encountered in a private marital contract. In effect, the prince surrendered authorship of his own biography. Nobody in the family, not the king, not Archduchess Petra, had known the clause existed until the separation proceedings forced it into the light. While the legal drama unfolded behind palace walls, a separate crisis was quietly reaching its breaking point. Alara Media Group, once celebrated as a scrappy, independent production company that had signed a headline-grabbing streaming deal 3 years prior, had been bleeding money for the better part of 18 months. Court filings related to the couple's shared property outside the capital, a countryside estate called Fenhallow, revealed a bridge loan taken out against the property the previous year, structured with punishing terms. a short repayment window, and an interest rate that, according to one financial disclosure, exceeded 14%. When repayments lapsed, the estate came within weeks of formal foreclosure proceedings. Attempts to refinance reportedly collapsed after outside lenders raised concerns about inconsistencies in Elara Media Group's public charitable filings, particularly around expenses claimed as community outreach that overlapped substantially with costs tied to the couple's personal security detail. None of this had been made public before the separation proceedings forced financial disclosures into the open. Meanwhile, a planned docuseries about the couple's charitable work, once pitched as a 5-part flagship project, was quietly shelved. An internal memo obtained by a national newspaper described the decision using blunt corporate language: brand fatigue, declining engagement, ongoing narrative risk. For a couple who had built much of their public identity around financial independence from the crown, the numbers told an uncomfortable story. Independence had come at a steep and largely hidden cost. Here is where the story takes its strangest turn. Lord Bastion, a distant cousin to the royal line, who had spent the better part of a decade in self-imposed exile from public royal life following an unrelated financial scandal of his own, resurfaces in this story in a way almost nobody anticipated. According to testimony later, given to a parliamentary standards committee, Lord Bastion had maintained informal, largely unnoticed contact with members of Elara's legal and media team over the course of roughly a year. The nature of that contact, as described in the committee's findings, involved Bastion sharing his own hard-won knowledge of how royal legal protections functioned, knowledge gained, ironically, from his own scandal years earlier, in exchange for what one committee member's report delicately called the prospect of narrative rehabilitation. In plainer terms, Bastion, cut off from royal favor and desperate for a path back into public relevance, appears to have quietly advised Elara's team on how to use the palace's own legal architecture against it, in the hope that a friendlier, more sympathetic portrayal of himself might eventually emerge from a media operation grateful for his help. The palace has not confirmed the full extent of these communications, and Lord Bastion's representatives have disputed the committee's characterization. But the fallout was immediate. Whatever residual access Bastion had to family events or royal patronage was formally withdrawn within days of the committee's preliminary findings becoming public. Archduchess Petra's reaction, according to a source close to her office, was not anger. It was something colder. She went very quiet, the source said. With her, that's always the worst sign. The final agreement, signed in mid-February under legal supervision at the Valemore Family Court of Chancery, ran to over 100 pages across several annexes, an unusually elaborate document even by the standards of high-profile royal separations. It covered the division of shared property, including Fenhollow Estate and various commercial holdings tied to Elara Media Group. It established permanent, structured custody arrangements for Tamsin and Iona, with the Crown's Child Welfare Office granted ongoing oversight authority, a provision that, notably, neither parent contested. It addressed financial obligations going forward, effectively unwinding years of informal financial support the Crown had quietly extended to the couple. And buried in Annex D was a clause that would dominate headlines for weeks. A total prohibition on either parent using the children's names, images, voices, or life stories in any commercial or media project, including streaming series, merchandising, or any likeness generated through emerging digital or artificial intelligence technologies, without formal written clearance from the Crown's legal office. This clause, quickly nicknamed the Iona Clause by the press after the younger of the two children, was, by all accounts, the single most contested provision in the entire agreement. Duchess Elara's legal team pushed back on it for nearly 3 weeks, arguing it infringed on her ability to tell her own story as a mother. Crown lawyers held firm. The final language survived almost entirely intact. Legal commentator Dame Rosalind Fenwick, who has covered royal family law for over 2 decades, offered the sharpest summary of why the clause mattered so much. This was never really about money or brand value. It was about a family drawing a line around what a childhood is allowed to become a lived experience, not raw material for someone else's media company. For weeks after the settlement was signed, Prince Rhys said almost nothing publicly. Friends described him as withdrawn, uncharacteristically quiet, absent from the handful of public engagements he might normally have attended. Then, in a short, unscheduled statement released through the palace press office, not a press conference, not an interview, just a written statement in his own words, he spoke. He acknowledged, for the first time publicly, that he had not fully understood the scope of the narrative control clause when he signed it years earlier. I signed it in a season of my life when I wanted more than anything to protect a relationship I believed in, he wrote. I did not understand until very recently what I had actually given away. He went further, describing what he called the slow, disorienting experience of watching his own public image be shaped by decisions he had no part in making, appearing in projects, interviews, and public appearances that had been negotiated, approved, and packaged without his direct input. I was present in almost every version of my own story, he wrote, and absent from nearly every decision about how it was told. He also addressed the allegations involving Lord Bastion directly, though carefully, noting that he had learned of the alleged communications through the same parliamentary process as the public, and that he had no interest in adding cruelty to a story that already has enough of it. It was, observers noted, a notably restrained response given the circumstances. Restraint that several commentators suggested was deliberately aimed at protecting his children from further public scrutiny rather than protecting himself. The line from his statement that spread furthest, quoted in nearly every major outlet within hours, was simple. I don't think any of us can move forward as a family until the truth is out in the open. Not for headlines. For them. A reference, unmistakably, to Tamsin and Iona. Public opinion polling conducted in the days following the settlement's announcement showed a striking shift. A clear majority of respondents expressed support for the Crown's decision to impose strict limits on commercial use of the children's images, regardless of which parent might benefit. A smaller but still significant majority expressed sympathy for Prince Rhys specifically, a notable change from polling conducted just a year earlier, when public sentiment had been considerably more divided. Duchess Alara, for her part, has not issued a lengthy public statement, though a brief message posted to her personal social media account, since deleted, reportedly described the settlement as painful, but not the end of my story. Alara Media Group has not commented on the financial disclosures made during the proceedings. Lord Bastion's representatives issued a short statement denying any wrongdoing and stating that he acted at all times in good faith, offering only friendly counsel to a family member's spouse during a difficult period. The parliamentary committee's inquiry into his conduct remains ongoing. Strip away the palace, the titles, and the tabloid headlines, and what's left is a story that could happen, in smaller, less publicized forms, in any family going through a difficult separation. A fight over whose version of events gets told, a parent trying to protect children from becoming content, and a marriage that dissolved partly because one partner didn't fully grasp what they'd agreed to years before signing became a crisis. The Iona Clause, whatever else it becomes in legal textbooks, represents an institution drawing a boundary it had never quite had to draw so explicitly before, that children, however famous their parents, are not intellectual property. That a childhood does not belong to a media company, a streaming platform, or even to a parent's ambition, however well-intentioned that ambition might be. Archduchess Petra, whose steady hand guided much of the Crown's response throughout this ordeal, was reported to have offered a private assessment to colleagues that has since leaked and become something of an unofficial epitaph for the entire episode. We did not seek this fight. But once it touched the children, there was no version of neutrality left available to us. As for Prince Rhys, he remains, by most accounts, in a complicated place, not fully returned to public royal duty, not fully separate from it either, still working through what friends describe as a slow, private reckoning with a marriage, and a decade of choices he's only now beginning to fully understand. Whatever comes next for him, for Alara, and for a parliamentary inquiry that is far from finished with Lord Bastion, one thing seems clear. The version of this family story that emerges from here will be one they choose together, page by page, rather than one negotiated away in a contract nobody fully read.